Okay, AP Environmental Science, good morning. This is topic 8.11, which is on sewage treatment. So, again, we're just kind of continuing here with our unit on water pollution, aquatic pollution. Um, so, let's talk a little bit today about sewage and how we actually treat that stuff that leaves our house. So, we're going to begin with just kind of what wastewater is. Wastewater, another term for it is sewage. But this is just water from our homes. Typically anything that goes down a drain is going to be considered sewage. Now, there's typically two different categories that we discuss, and that's what we call black water, which is your toilet water. So that will have a lot of organic material in it, obviously. And then we have our gray water, which is soapy water. That's water from sinks and showers and things like that. That's a lot more chemical based. What goes down the sinks and the shower drains and all that type of stuff. So pretty much in everybody's home, right? They're going to produce sewage, and they're going to produce a mixture of both black water and also gray water. Just a few statistics here I want to throw at you real quick. 15% of the world's population does not have access to sufficient supplies of drinking water. So, what that basically means is that 15% of the world doesn't have a sink. They don't have, a way to get fresh water coming into their homes. Now, couple with that the fact that 42% of the world's population lacks proper sanitation. So that means they don't have a toilet. All right. Again, most of this stuff is happening in the developing world, but a lot of people. That's all. Think about it, that's almost half the people in the world, don't have access to a toilet, at least in their homes. 3 million people die every single year due to what we call waterborne diseases. Now, waterborne diseases are basically generated by people drinking out of a water supply that's contaminated with sewage. It was contaminated with basically human waste. Diseases like cholera, hepatitis, all these things, malaria. Most of these diseases you never really hear of in the United States. Now, the stomach flu, that one isn't necessarily contact, or it's not necessarily um, um, passed on by drinking contaminated water, but there are flu viruses that can actually live in that stuff. Um, but I mean, we don't really hear of this stuff, in developed countries. We hear about these things more in the developing world, where again, sanitation is so poor. Now, one of the things that we do when we're testing wastewater, we test our water to see, if it's safe to drink. Um, and because there's so many different diseases, that could live in water, we typically look for one kind of general type of bacterial species. We call these things indicator species. And the ones that we're looking for are what we call fecal coliform bacteria. Fecal coliform bacteria are basically bacteria that live in the human digestive tract. A really good example of this is a bacteria called E. coli. Now, E. coli is an organism. It's a bacteria that lives in the digestive tract of lots of animals, including human beings. Now, the reason why we test water for the presence of those things is because if those are in our drinking water, then there's a pretty good indication that our drinking water is contaminated with animal waste of some type, whether it be humans or cows or pigs or whatever. Most of these fecal coliform bacteria are harmless strains of bacteria. There are some, though, that are deadly. Things like E. coli 015787. That one is found in the intestinal tracts of cows, and other farm animals. And if that gets into your water supply, that can get you really, really sick. But again, most of these fecal coliform, they really aren't harmful. But if they are in the water, then it usually indicates to us high levels, again, of animal waste, which could mean other diseases. So we do constantly check our water supplies, not just drinking water, but for example, the water at the beach, swimming pools. One of the things down here at Crown Point, they test our water usually a couple times a week, and one of the things that they test for is fecal coliform bacteria. If there's high levels of that in a swimming pool, then you got to close the pool down. You can't, you know, it's like you're swimming in human waste. So, I mean, I think we would kind of know if there was like a bunch of poop swimming, floating in the swimming pool, but we do test, the pool water for that. But again, I mean, there's probably going to be a little tiny bit of fecal coliform in most bodies of water, but if those levels get to a certain, or get within a certain range, then you have to be a little bit careful. So, how do we treat our wastewater? I mean, when you flush the toilet, when the water goes down the sink of your house, where does it go? I mean, how does it get treated? In the United States, for example, so that water can eventually be reused. So, we're going to talk today about some different technologies that we use to actually treat our wastewater. But again, understand that these technologies are really only found in the developed world. Most developing countries don't even have these technologies, which seems very primitive, but that's the case. Now, pretty much regardless of the solutions that we use to treat our wastewater, the thing that we really kind of use to our advantage to help us treat our wastewater is we actually use bacteria. And I'll explain today, when I go through these different technologies, that bacteria are actually very useful in cleaning water. There's bacteria that live in water that can be very dangerous, but we actually use other types of bacteria to actually clean the water and make it less harmful. So we'll talk about some different ways that we do this. Now, the two most common ways that this is done are two different systems. One of them is called a septic system. And some of you may have septic systems in your home. Maybe you've heard your parents refer to your septic tank. Not everybody has a septic tank on their property, but we'll talk about what those are. And then finally, we have what we call a sewage treatment plant, and we'll talk about how those facilities work and how they, again, treat your water. So let's first take a look here at this one. This is called a septic system. Now, a septic system, these are a lot more common in homes of people who live in rural areas. These are homes that were built that were not um, um, tapped into the city sewage system or the city drain pipes or the city sewage treatment plant. So, I mean, there are people, for example, who live in Crown Point who their pipes that lead away from their house that carry away their wastewater, those pipes are not connected to a sewer. All right, a sewer drain that would carry all of our wastewater away from our home. Instead, these houses have their own little water treatment facility, kind of built on their own property, and this is what we call a septic system. And if you look at the picture here, it's fairly simple. All right, we have two like major components to it. We have something called a septic tank, which is a big holding tank for all of our wastewater, and that's buried under your ground. Okay, and the other thing is called a drain field, or we call it a leach field, and we'll talk about what that does. But again, take a look at this picture here. All the wastewater from your home pretty much just, oops, put myself over here. All that wastewater from your home pretty much just goes into this septic tank. Now, you'll also notice here at the very bottom of the picture, right, there's some groundwater. So this individual has a well that they tap into that brings water into their home. All right, so let's talk about how this kind of works. It's actually kind of interesting. All right, first of all, let's start off with the septic tank. All right, the septic tank is, again, it's a big, container that basically collects all the wastewater from your home. So you'll notice here that there's what we call an inlet pipe, right? So that the water that comes in here is coming in from your house. So you can imagine, what's in that water, right? That's gray water, it's black water, it's got pretty much anything that goes down your drains is going to end up in this tank. All right. So it's important that this septic system tank is kind of buried under your ground. It can be accessed, but it's going to be something that you kind of want fairly far away from your home and probably underground a few feet. Now, the wastewater that flows into this tank, once it gets in there, it's going to kind of separate. And when it separates, it's going to separate into three layers. All right. The top layer is what we call the scum layer. The scum layer is basically anything that will float, right, on water. I mean, think about things that you flush down the toilet or that go down your drain. I mean, there are some things that float. I don't know. Let's just, for example, let's say that you, I don't know, throw a Q-tip down your toilet drain or something. I don't know. Q-tips, things to clean your ears with. I mean, those things will float on water, right? So that's going to end up in this top layer. That's called the scum layer, right? Scum floats. The sludge layer is the stuff that sinks. Okay. Now, the sludge layer, let's be honest, it's probably mostly poop. Okay. And anything else that's going to sink. All right. So the heavy stuff, the more dense stuff is going to sink, the lighter stuff is going to float. So you get this kind of separation inside your septic tank. Now, the middle is going to be all your water. Okay. That's it's clearer. I'm not going to say it's totally clear, but that's called your septage layer. That septage layer is most likely, in fact, it is loaded with bacteria. And this is not clean water, all right, but it's the water component of what comes down. All right, it could be, that can have detergents in it. It could have urine in it. It could have a whole bunch of stuff, but it's all in that tank. Now, you'll also notice that we have an outlet pipe, right? So, what comes in is eventually going to come out, but what's going to come out is all the water. All right, all the solid material is going to remain inside the tank. So now we take a look at what we call the leach field or the drainage field. So here we have a series of pipes that leads out. In the background here, you see your septic tank. So these pipes, what's draining out of those pipes is all the septage, all that water that's in your tank. Now, you'll notice that in these pipes, there are little tiny holes. Okay, and those little tiny holes mean that whatever water kind of comes through those things, and it's all controlled by gravity here, all that water is just going to drain out into that field. Now, when they engineer these leach fields, what they do is they'll lay down a whole bunch of rock or kind of crushed gravel. It might be like maybe limestone or whatever it is. But this rock is very porous and it'll allow all that water to kind of slowly seep through it. But as that water is seeping through, like any larger particles will most likely just be trapped in the rock. Um, but all that water is just going to drain through. Now, below this crushed rock is just going to be soil. So your soil might be down here, for example. Okay. But you got to remember one thing about soil. Soil is alive, right? It contains organisms. It contains worms and bacteria and a whole bunch of organisms. So yeah, I mean, you can imagine in this septage water, there's a lot of harmful bacteria that are in there. Well, as those bacteria move through the soil, the natural bacteria that exist in the soil usually end up out competing it and basically end up killing all of the harmful bacteria in our waste. So I'm going to kind of go back to this picture here real quick. Oops, right here. Okay. You see how underneath The drainage field is groundwater, right? This is the stuff that's being pumped into the house that they drink out of. Well, you might think, well, all that water that's coming out of those pipes, it's got, fecal coliform bacteria in it and chemicals and all this stuff. But the soil takes care of all of that. So as the water is kind of percolating through the soil, all the harmful components are actually remaining in the soil. And the water just eventually makes its way through to the groundwater. And by that time, it's totally fresh water. So that water can be pumped back up into the home. So I mean, it's kind of a neat thing. I mean, it's a very simple process, but we're actually using bacteria that naturally live in the soil to help purify our water for us so that it can be reused. I mean, it's really kind of amazing how a septic tank and a septic system actually works. Now, some pros and cons of septic systems. Number one, it doesn't really take any energy. It doesn't use any electricity. Water flows downstream or downhill, so by gravity. So that's kind of a nice thing. One of the disadvantages of it are those septic tanks do need to be cleaned. I've never owned one, so I can't really attest to how often they need to be cleaned. I'm just going to kind of by what I've read. The sludge and all the scum that's in there. So there needs to be a professional, septic tank handler that comes out and removes all that and pumps it out of there. Most likely every 5 to 10 years, depending on how many people live in the home and how much waste you produce. But when all that's because that's all solid waste and it's hazardous, it's toxic. So when we remove that, that needs to be taken to a treatment facility and it needs to be disposed of properly. So that's, I guess, one kind of disadvantage of having those. All right, now the other type of wastewater treatment is a sewage treatment plant. This is what most people, this is how our water gets treated, unless you have a septic system. All right, so I mean, let's just kind of take a look at this picture, and then we'll kind of get into all the words on here and all this type of stuff. So, right up here, for example, here we have a neighborhood of homes, a cluster of homes, whatever. Most of the houses in Crown Point, we're all kind of connected to the same sewer system. So, for example, this house here, when they flush the toilet, all of their sewage eventually goes into the same pipe that all the other homes go into. Everybody's houses kind of drains into the same sewer, and all of that wastewater is pumped to a sewage treatment plant. We have multiple sewage treatment plants in Crown Point. So once that water gets to the treatment plant, then it goes through a sequence of events before eventually, if you'll take a look over here, that wastewater can be returned back into the environment. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking all of our water from our homes, we're cleaning it in these treatment plants, and it's eventually being discharged. So let's talk about the different steps to what happens here. So this first step is what we call the primary treatment. If you can take a look at the picture, really kind of explains what's going on here. So you notice again, here's the drain pipe leading from the neighborhood. It goes into what we call the primary treatment tank, which is a big tank of water. I mean, it's probably about as big as 7 or 8 swimming pools. I mean, this is a lot of water that can go into this thing. But you'll notice when the water first comes in, it passes through a screen. In fact, it probably passes through multiple screens. But those screens are basically there to just filter out any large particles, large items. I mean, imagine, what gets flushed down the toilet, in people's houses. A lot of it, there might be plastics. We talk about Q-tips. I mean, who knows, what's going down there? Plastic baggies. I mean, God knows what. But all of that stuff has to get filtered out initially before we clean the rest of the water. So all of that scum is going to kind of get settled out there, but some of it may be small enough to actually pass through the screen. So when it gets into this tank here, okay, you'll notice that the water on the bottom of this tank is black. That's all the sludge. But at the top of that water might be any remaining scum. And that can just get skimmed out or eventually removed. But you'll notice here that all of that sludge, all of that solid waste, that needs to be, basically it needs to be pumped to another tank, kind of like a septic tank, and that all needs to be hauled away, and it has to either be incinerated or it has to be taken to a special type of landfill. But that's kind of what happens in this primary tank. In the primary tank, basically, this is kind of like a big septic tank. It just kind of settles all the water out. We remove all the solid waste, and then we can pass it on to what we call secondary treatment. Now you'll notice here in secondary treatment, again, some of that water on the bottom is black. So any remaining sludge that could be in that water, that's going to settle down. Again, that would be eventually carried out of there. But in this secondary tank, basically, um, what we're doing in this tank is we're using bacteria. There's a ton of bacteria in this secondary treatment tank. And those bacteria are actually devouring any additional organic waste or any nutrients that might be in that water. That might include other bacteria, it might include nitrogen and phosphate. All of that stuff needs to be removed before it gets pumped out. Now, in addition to that, we have usually kind of another component to the secondary treatment. They typically use chlorine. Sometimes they use ultraviolet light, maybe some additional chemicals to kill anything that's remaining in that wastewater. So by the time that water leaves this pipe and drains into a lake or a pond or wherever it's going to go, a river, a stream, that water is essentially clean. These bacteria do a really good job of cleaning it up. Anything that's left is cleaned up by all the chlorine or the UV light, and then again that gets pumped out into the environment. So again, that term effluent. Effluent is just the wastewater that's been discharged, but it's been cleaned. All right. So when it comes to sewage, kind of the ultimate goal is to release water back into the environment that's been treated, and it's healthy water. I mean, we can, it's water that can be reconsumed one day, and it's fresh. One thing about sewage or sewage treatment plants is some of them are more effective than others from eliminating things like nutrients, for example, like nitrates and phosphates from the water. Some plants have what we call a tertiary treatment. The tertiary treatment is kind of an additional treatment that helps remove some of those things. So some are more effective than others are, but I will say this about sewage treatment plants. This is the reason why we live in the United States and our country is not overrun by diseases like cholera and typhoid and all of these intestinal diseases that you see in these developing countries. These technologies are the reason why. Okay, so you can go and get a glass of water, and you can flush things down the toilet, and you can be assured that that water is going to be clean. So that's a really good thing in this country. All right, now another big issue with sewage is this happens mainly in big metropolitan areas like cities. A lot of older sewage treatment plants, a lot of drainage pipes are also connected to stormwater drainage. All right, for example, here in this picture here, maybe if you've ever been walking around